Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. This is a special edition of the IB Nation Sports Talk Show, and it's only special because of how we're going to get to it. I'm Brian Driscoll, the publisher at Irish Breakdown. You're not going to hear much from me right now. So we had a little bit of a change up today. So Notre Dame announced this afternoon that two of the people that will be available in the press conference tonight after practice was going to be offensive coordinator Tommy Rees and defensive coordinator Al Golden. So Sean Stiers, our normal host of the IB Nation Sports Talk show, we chatted a little bit and decided that it would be ideal to have Sean at the press conference tonight, which meant we had to record this show a little bit early. So Vince and Sean just wrapped up the show. I was able to download it, and we're going to play it. And it's essentially the conversation that they had was about Marcus Freeman and, the notion of whether or not Marcus Freeman was and is the right man for the job. Obviously, there's these strong overreactions to the disappointing start to the season, and it has been disappointing. I think everybody would agree with that. I think at worst, most people felt this team would be 1-1 after 2 weeks. They're 0-2. They lost to Marshall. And so, of course, the people you haven't heard from are the people that like to overreact to things. Oh, is he the right guy? And all those other type of things. So, I think when I look at it, it's like, okay, let's decide, was this the right hire or not? And that's what Sean and Vince are going to talk about. And so they're going to discuss, the things that have gone well so far, what Marcus Freeman has done so far to show that he's doing well. What are the things that maybe he hasn't done as well? Kind of talk about, where things are right now. And then they'll both give their opinion of whether or not they believe that Marcus Freeman is, in fact, the right man for the job. Was he the right man for the job when he was hired, and is he the right man for the job moving forward? So they will answer that question in their opinion. I think you all know my opinion. The answer is yes, but Sean and Vince are going to give their opinion as well. So we have that podcast rolling, and I am going to hit play. What I'm going to ask from you all is to let me know when I hit play. Just give me a thumbs up or a yes to let me know that you can hear it. So this is going to be about an hour and 15 minutes long. Then I'm going to come back at the end, answer any super chats that are going to be there throughout the show, and if there's any other pertinent questions about it. But this was a really, really good show. I haven't even been able to listen to the whole thing yet because they just finished recording about 20 minutes ago. But I did get a chance to talk to them, and it sounds like it was a very interesting conversation, to say the least. So without further ado, let's bring in Vince and Sean for this show. So again, I'll just ask that you all let me know when I hit play here that you can hear the guys. Okay, so you guys can't hear that. Let's get this fixed here real quick. Let me get this rolling here. So I'm going to do it this way. So let's try it this way. This should work. All right.
All right. Well, we're off and rolling, and technically I'm in two places at once right now. If you're listening to this quote unquote live or watching this quote unquote live. And Vince and I had to record a little bit earlier today because we get to talk to both coordinators over at Notre Dame tonight after practice, which is, we were just talking before we started this up, Vince. That is a big rarity to get any kind of assistant coaches during the season. So we got to jump on that when we can get it.
You got that right. But if anybody can be in two places at once, buddy, it's you.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Well, this is not the start that anyone envisioned for this Notre Dame football team. 0-2 after the loss to Marshall, of course. And Marcus Freeman is 0-3 in terms of his first 3 games at Notre Dame. We're going to talk a lot about Marcus Freeman in today's show. First Notre Dame head coach to ever begin his tenure 0-3. I think by now probably most fans have probably heard that. Brian Kelly started 1-3. Lou Holtz started 1-4. And I know a lot of people are kind of falling back on that. And I've heard people kind of point to those when comparing this slow start for Marcus Freeman to the likes of Brian Kelly and Lou Holtz. So what do you think about that comparison when you see those starts 1-3, 1-4 versus Marcus Freeman's 0-3?
Well, it's tough because I don't think anybody anticipated that this was going to be the case, right? I mean, yes, 0-2 was very, very possible after he already lost the Fiesta Bowl, and you had Ohio State, waiting in the wings, right? 0-3 was unfathomable, right? Excuse me, that was sneaking up on me. Okay, so 0-3 was unfathomable. I didn't see that one coming a mile away, and I don't think anybody else did either. Comparing it to Lou Holtz and comparing it to Jerry Faust is difficult for me because this is not the type of team that those guys inherited. Those guys inherited teams from fired coaches, right? I mean, Jerry Faust didn't inherit a fired team, did he? A fired coach, did he?
Jerry Faust? No, I don't believe so.
Yeah, but obviously Lou Holtz inherited Jerry Faust's mess, and that was a complete rebuild. And so, not surprising, they're not going to start off that well. Well, Marcus Freeman inherited a roster that was college football playoff caliber. No matter what anybody says, that's what my contention. And starting 0-3 is tough for me. I would say 0-2. I mean, I'm not explaining away the Fiesta Bowl because if he won it, everybody'd be like, well, Marcus Freeman was the first guy to win New Year's Six Bowl, and he'd be getting all the credit for it. So he should get the blame. Don't get me wrong. But a lot of things are different this year with the coaching staff, all of it. It's all different.
Yeah.
And so I tend to look at it as 0-2. Even if he won that game, I would say 0-2, to be honest with you.
Sure.
But either way, it's not okay. He inherited a roster that is so much better than what those other guys inherited. He should not be 0-2. He should be 1-1, and you should still have all of your aspirations ahead of you, and that is clearly not the case. So it's hard for me to compare it to Lou Holtz and Jerry Fowler, and all of those guys. Like, it's very difficult for me, but I mean, I guess I get it. It's trying to make people feel better, but
I think that's pretty much what it is. I guess there's a little piece where you can say, well, they started off slow and things turned around.
Right.
So, but you're absolutely right. It's kind of an apples to oranges thing because of the fact that when most coaching changes are made, and specifically when these coaching changes have been made historically at Notre Dame, there have been very few handoffs of the baton from one successful regime to another, like Parsegian to Divine for example. And that's been 40 some years ago now.
More than
at this point. Most of them are Bob Davie to Tyrone Willingham to Charlie Weis, Charlie Weis to Brian Kelly. You've got a coach that was unsuccessful.
Sure.
You had to get rid of him, and you brought in someone to take over, and there had to be a roster rebuild, like Lou Holtz, when Jerry Faust took over, and when Brian Kelly, when Charlie Weis took over.
Yeah, and the roster wasn't bare when Willingham left it to Charlie Weis. That's why Charlie Weis had so much success, because there was offensive talent there. And the problem for Charlie Weis was he didn't know how to recruit defensive talent, and then, of course, build up his players and, that kind of a thing. I mean, we don't need to get into that, but the point I'm making is Weis had a decent roster to deal with, and therefore he was successful when he first started. But it pales in comparison to the roster that Marcus Freeman had. I mean, I'm as big a Marcus Freeman apologist as anybody, and maybe that'll come out as we go through this show. But at the same time, this is inexcusable. You had a roster that should be competing for a national championship, and you're sitting here 0-2 after a loss to a Sun Belt team. That's not okay. There are no excuses to make for that.
Yep, exactly. And there's a big difference when you're a team that just missed out on the college football playoff and went to a New Year's Six Bowl, and that's the roster you inherit. I know everyone likes to talk about some inexperience and all these different things, but there's a lot of experience, and there's still a lot of cohesion within the roster. And it's and again, like, if you want to look at it even long term, that team last year was obviously at the tail end of 5 consecutive double-digit
Yeah,
win seasons, so
absolutely.
again, it's apples to oranges and, maybe even pears to grapes, I don't know, or pears to lemons. I don't know exactly what you'd call it. Bob Davey also started 1-4. Jerry Faust started 1-2. Things obviously did not work out for those
Right.
guys,
Right.
So pointing, what we do know is Notre Dame has not looked very favorably, or the Notre Dame job has not looked very favorably upon first-time head coaches. And that's
fair.
that's the direction that we're going to go today, kind of looking at where Marcus Freeman is and looking, is he the guy for this? And by the way, I chose that title because, we're going to talk about, is Marcus Freeman the guy for this job, a first-time head coach and all that stuff. But that was the title of a Better Call Saul episode a couple years back from a season past. It came to mind right away, and I thought, well, that's kind of a catchy little title. We'll just go ahead and use that. So, as Brian Driscoll was telling me, it's a little vague. What does it exactly mean? Well, it was meant to be a little bit vague, so it teased our listeners and drew them into this podcast today. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. They've got to figure out exactly what it means. So here we are to kind of go with the whole thing. So after the loss, Freeman downplayed his inexperience as a head coach, as a factor in the struggles that Notre Dame has had so far. And again, you can write off Ohio State because they're the number 2 team in the country. You can't write off Marshall because they're a Sun Belt Conference team. They're a Group of 5 team.
Which you paid over $1 million to come to your stadium and beat you.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. You paid a lot of money to get them.
Not a lot of excuses here. They're just not.
And I was watching the NFL Network today now, and they're using, highlights from that Marshall win, and they're pumping hard. Marshall versus Bowling Green coming up on whatever, network it's going to be on this weekend. So everyone's trying to jump on the Marshall train right now.
Hey, Bowling Green played well against UCLA for like a half. So there you go. This could be a great matchup.
That's right. So there's this thing called the Peter Principle. Have you ever heard of this, Vince?
Not before I read your email.
Okay. So you may or may not have heard of it. Vince hasn't. That's fair. It's a theory that came from a book many, many years ago. A guy named Lawrence Peter wrote this book. And it basically says, and Peter Principle, if he had a better last name, it might be a little bit catchier, but it's at least got some alliteration, I guess.
Of course, he named it after himself. But no surprise there.
Exactly. But it says that people get promoted to their level of incompetence. In other words, you've got whatever job that you've got within whatever company, you get promoted from salesman to director of sales. Now you're managing the entire sales department. Maybe if you do good in that position, you get promoted to general manager, where now you're leading, more departments and all that. You keep going up the food chain until you can't move any farther. And this was something that came up a lot when I was in the military. Actually, it's, you get promoted, and there's different levels of leadership, and you go up the chain of command, and you get promoted to a point where essentially you are now ineffective. You get promoted to your level of incompetence, where you're not effective. In sports is a perfect, especially football. I think you're a position coach in football. You're doing great as a position coach. You're well renowned as running backs coach or whatever it happens to be. You get made an offensive coordinator now. And if you're a good offensive coordinator, eventually you become a head coach. Well, maybe sometimes you get to coordinator and that's your level of incompetence. You're not such a great coordinator. Next thing you know, you're a position coach again. Or again, if you're successful, then you become a head coach. But if you're not a good head coach, then you end up being a coordinator once again. And there are a lot of different examples of this. One of the first ones who came to mind was Wade Phillips. Great example. Guy who was a coach forever, great defensive coordinator in the NFL, son of Bum Phillips. And, he was a great defensive coordinator, kept getting head coaching jobs, but he flopped every time. So he'd get a head coaching job, wouldn't work out very well. He was a head coach, Denver, Buffalo, and Dallas.
I forgot about
And
Denver.
yeah, he would so he would do great as a defensive coordinator. He'd become a head coach, never won a playoff game as a head coach. He'd get bounced back down to coordinator. He'd run a great defense for a few years, and then the next thing you know, he's a head coach again, and it kept happening. So essentially, that was his level of incompetence. Was he was not made to be a head coach, but he was a great defensive coordinator. You can kind of hide as an assistant coach, I think. And you've been,
Absolutely.
You've been a coach at different levels. You can hide as an assistant. You can't hide as a head coach, though.
Right. Nope. Completely agree with that. And it's a very interesting theory. And I'm going to say that no matter what level of business that you're in, you've seen this firsthand.
Right.
Maybe it's you. Maybe it's somebody close to you. Maybe it's somebody that becomes your boss that maybe didn't deserve it or whatever. But we've all seen this, right? You hit your ceiling at some point, whether it's you hit your ceiling at CEO or you hit your ceiling as lead guy on, the assembly line or whatever. Everybody has a ceiling. I mean, it is what it is, man. My ceiling is color commentary, baby. I am not a play-by-play guy. That's where my level of incompetence lies. I've seen it before.
There you go.
So it's good to know your own limitations. But
that's right.
But seriously, I have seen it in many lines of work that I've had, and I guarantee everybody in the chat has seen this at some point or another in their line of work.
Well, and since this is a Notre Dame podcast, I think the one that everyone would probably identify with the most is Charlie Weis, and you brought 100%. Him up earlier. Great example that I think that Notre Dame fans can identify with. Great offensive coordinator, obviously, with the Patriots. He had his Super Bowl rings, as he liked to let everyone know.
Yes.
Walked in the door with his Super Bowl rings, and because he won those Super Bowls and because he had the connection to Notre Dame, even though he never played football, obviously, at Notre Dame or anywhere else, he comes in, has a great couple of years with Brady Quinn, Jeff Samardzija, Tommy Zbikowski, and those guys. But then what happens? Well, those guys graduate. And he finds out there's more to college football than, just having a decided schematic advantage and being nasty and all that kind of stuff. But, I've said this before, if college football was like the NFL and he could have held on to that core group like you can in the NFL for several years, I think Notre Dame, would have been pretty good for a while.
Good call.
But you obviously can't do that. Yeah. You've got roster turnover, and that brought you 3-7 in 2007.
Right. You have to be able to develop that roster as well.
Right.
And that obviously was not happening.
Right.
He came to Notre Dame as an acclaimed offensive coordinator, and that's exactly what he did at Notre Dame. He recruited offensive players. He was an offensive coordinator / head coach whose offense was prolific and whose defenses were lacking behind because that was not a priority for him. I mean, he did a great job as an offensive coordinator at Notre Dame. Let's be honest, right? But as a head coach, he didn't understand how to build a program, how to build a college program. And that situation continued on at his other stops as well. You saw it
I realized,
2 different ways, buddy.
Yeah, I realized people around here, weren't paying that close attention to Kansas. The headline is Charlie Weis got that big contract at Kansas and then got fired after a couple of years. Obviously, being a Kansas alum, I've looked and read and, kind of followed up on it. I mean, he got fired in 2014 after he was head coach there for a couple of years. He tries this roster overhaul. He tried to use the blueprint that Bill Snyder did at Kansas State by bringing in JUCO guys. And then, he kicked some guys off the team who were doing stuff that they shouldn't have been doing. And, there was some virtue to some of the things that he was doing. But a lot of those JUCO guys he brought in were non-qualifiers. And then, coming out of high school. So they didn't have good grades. And so then they were not making grades at Kansas. So he gets fired in 2014. After they fired him, the scholarship limit is obviously 85. They had 60 scholarship players on the roster after they fired him. And because of the fact that you cannot, so they're 25 behind, because of the fact that you can't oversign, they are just now catching up with the roster to getting the scholarship numbers back to where they need to be 8 years later. So you talk about, not being able to run a program, that is just, had that happened at a place like Notre Dame or Alabama or someplace else, it would have been much more highly publicized what happened with that roster. But I still say Charlie Weis would have been and could still be a great NFL offensive coordinator,
No doubt.
maybe even college coordinator. But he
Yeah.
was not meant to be a college head coach.
Hey, maybe at this point you welcome Charlie back with open arms. Hey, you want to be the OC here at Notre Dame?
Right.
Might be an opening. No, I'm just kidding.
That's right.
I'm obviously playing to the chat right now, but
Yeah.
But no, I agree with you. I think that Charlie could be a very good offensive coordinator. Now, financially, he doesn't need to. He's sitting on a pile of money right now. He doesn't even need to work, but he could, and I think he would be a very successful offensive coordinator.
I do too.
Someplace, as long as there was a strong head coach. You know what I mean? Somebody that could tell him what to do when it comes to developing the players and, all of those different things. Like
and that can be tough at this point when you are sitting on a stack of money and you've got that Jersey attitude and everything else that Charlie has, and but
I think he's content following his son and going that route right now.
Who's doing great himself? And he's gone the college route, and it's worked out well for him. But the average tenure for an FBS football coach is 3.8 years, and part of it is because of guys like this. Promoted to their level of incompetence, they get a job as a head coach, they wash out, and then they go back to being a coordinator or whatever. Maybe they become an NFL assistant or whatever it happens to be. So again, this brings us to where we are with Marcus Freeman. Now, again, it's only been 3 games total and 2 games this season, but we've got a lot of people already, especially after Marshall's Saturday, calling for Marcus Freeman's head. So it's at least worth the discussion. What we have seen so far, 2 games, again, a lot of people calling for Marcus Freeman. My question to you, do you think Marcus Freeman falls into this category? Is he at a point where you can say, well, he's in over his head, he shouldn't be a head coach right now? What do you think?
Well, is he learning on the job? Yes, he is learning on the job. I don't think there's any debating that, right? There have been more bumps in the road for me with him than I anticipated, if I'm being honest, because
in a short amount of time.
Absolutely. Because being a head coach is more than just what happens on Saturdays. If we're talking college football, right? It's also what happens Sunday through Friday. And it's also what happens in the off season. And Marcus Freeman won the off season. There's no doubt about that. He's a dynamic recruiter. I thought he hired a really good coaching staff. I really did. I thought he had a really good coaching staff under his belt. Brian has insinuated that there's some other parts of the program that still need to be kind of shed, I guess, and replaced, behind the scenes. But that I honestly can't speak to that. I'm not 100% sure what that's all about. But it felt to me like he made some hard decisions on some of the coaches that he didn't retain after the Fiesta Bowl. And so that, to me, that's a head coach. You're able to make those tough decisions, right? Yeah. I thought that he hired a good staff. I thought that he handled recruiting very well. It was a well-organized machine. Yes, part of that is Chad Bowden, no doubt about it, but you still have to be willing to do all of the stuff that he was doing, which was not the case in the past. So I thought he was checking all the boxes. I really did. Now, originally when he said, we want to be a team that's going to run the ball and stop the run and all that, it sounded good. Like it sounded very much like a defensive-minded coach and what he would want to do as a head coach. I had no problem with that. The problem started to arise when they were clearly not that team, at least in the first 2 games, and there was no change.
But they kept sticking with that.
Exactly.
Thinking that that's what they are. Yeah.
That is my biggest problem up to this point is it stubbornness? Is it ignorance? I'm not sure. I don't know what that is yet, right? That was very frustrating for me. Now, this situation, losing Tyler Buckner to injury for the season, starting 0-2 with a lot of your goals and aspirations pretty much set to the side at this point, I feel like it's an opportunity to kind of hit the reset button. Now, I know Notre Dame fans aren't going to want to hear that because of the aspirations that everybody had, but I think, is he over his head? I think he checks a lot more boxes than he doesn't check right now.
I still agree with that.
I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt moving forward, but I need to see some adaptation. I really need to see some adaptation moving forward. That's that's kind of where I'm at right now. I don't think he's over his head yet because he does check a lot of boxes, but you've got to get the game day and the preparation stuff right. Otherwise, that other stuff doesn't matter.
Right. Because at his press conference Monday, he said, he kind of alluded to the fact that maybe the focus that he was giving the team wasn't in the right place. Like there's all those cliches that we would hear from Brian Kelly about traits and the process and, all those basically coaching cliches that you hear from just about everybody. And they are cliches, but they become cliches just because you hear them repeated so often, especially like the thing about the process. And like listening to Marcus Freeman yesterday, it sounds like maybe the process was lost a little bit and it became maybe too outcome driven as opposed to, just focus on this rep right now, and that kind of stuff. And, making sure that your focus is as narrow as possible. And that's kind of what's shown up a little bit when we've seen some of the play that they've had, from play to play, series to series. I completely agree with what you're talking about because like we haven't seen Marcus Freeman make, and we're going to talk about what happened in the Monday Night Football game a little bit, how that game ended in rapid fire. We haven't seen Marcus, like if the game against Marshall had come down to they've got 4th and 5 and Marcus Freeman decides to kick a 64-yard field goal rather than trying to, when he's got all 3 timeouts and, that kind of thing. We're probably having a different conversation even today, because we haven't seen those red flags. He's making stupid decisions.
I agree. And that's what everybody was worried about going in, right? Because of the end of the first half again, the Fiesta Bowl and some of the, time management. And like people were worried about the nuts and the bolts of managing a game. And I mean, he hasn't really had an opportunity, but he hasn't screwed anything up in that regard. It's the preparation.
That's a low bar. You haven't screwed anything up.
I know it is. I'm with you. It is a low bar now.
But I mean, what's distressing is there was enough goodwill coming out of, as frustrating as it was to watch how the game unfolded against Ohio State and to be leading and then see the game get away from Ohio State, but to be in that game on the road and all the factors that we've talked about, first time head coach, first time starting quarterback, all those things. To go from that to losing at home the next week to Marshall, you lose a lot of faith, I think, and that's
no doubt. He lost on that goodwill.
Right, the common thread through the first couple games is something you touched on. It's felt to me like watching the Fiesta Bowl, watching the Ohio State game. Again, the Fiesta is still a little bit of a one-off, but in both instances, they went into a game with a very specific game plan. Obviously, it worked for a while against Oklahoma State. It worked, different game plan, but that worked for a while against Ohio State.
Sure.
But there was no counterpunch. There was never an adjustment to the other team making an adjustment to them. There was never a counter, so it was like that to me was an inexperienced coach going in with a very specific, this is what we need to do. You always have to have that but if that you can go to. But if this happens, then we need to adjust and go on to this or whatever the game tells you, over the course of there was never that counterpunch. Now we saw a little bit of counterpunch against Marshall, but the problem obviously was they would go to their changeup and then for whatever reason, they would go back and start throwing fastballs all over the place, like not finding the strike zone with the fastball after the changeup or the curveball was working.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that was odd. And that, again, doesn't show I don't know if it's the faith in the changes or what it is exactly. And that is disturbing. There's no doubt about it. And again, he's going to have a lot of opportunities to prove himself moving forward. Like I said, this is kind of a reset button moment. But I also failed to mention the fact that, again, this is an off-season thing, but it is a box that I think he checked in a good way, was, reaching back out to the alumni and like all of those different things. Like he checked all of those boxes. I mean, he won the off-season, but like the preparation for the actual games is like, man, that's what being a head coach is. Yes. That's where I need you to be. And I'm praying that he can learn from these 2 games. I was hoping he learned from the Ohio State game. We wouldn't have this issue. But he needs to learn moving forward that, you've got to adapt because not everything that you plan going in is going to be effective and it's going to work.
See, and look, like I know a lot of people love the fact that they went back to the victory march from the Basilica,
Sure.
to the
Yeah, I forgot
stadium
about
on
that.
game day. They,
Yeah.
they changed that. But again, like you had won double-digit games 5 years in a row, and you weren't doing this. Like, was that a change that you needed to make right away? Again, I realize a lot of the alumni and people, close to the program who were used to that back in the day love that. But, again, they're like, that's buying into an intangible that doesn't necessarily have direct effect on how,
Sure.
so just like everybody, he won the offseason with the recruiting. He won the offseason with making a decision like that, making that announcement. We're going back and we're going to start doing the march. We're going to do game day mass and all these things. And that they also, everything sounded great in theory, but at the end of the day, how are you going to manage the week in terms of preparation to getting your guys ready? And how are you going to manage that Saturday? We haven't seen the fatal flaws again on Saturday, but this doesn't look like a team that is completely focused on what it needs to be focused on right now. Well, and that's the biggest knock.
Right. And I will also say, and I kind of mentioned this yesterday and maybe other shows, I don't know, they all run together.
They all blend together at some point.
They do.
Right?
They do. But what I will say is, regardless of whatever game plan Notre Dame had coming into the Marshall game, okay, it shouldn't have mattered. The game plan should not have mattered. If Notre Dame just executes, if they just execute,
well, see, and that's what he's falling back on now. Well, if we execute, well, you're the head coach, and ultimately you're responsible for them not executing.
And I think that's my bigger issue is that, we had a lot of faith in Harry Heastand. We had a lot of faith in Coach Stuckey. We had a lot of faith in Coach Reis, right? And I know I'm kind of sticking to the offensive side of the ball here, but at the same time, you gave up 21 points. You should have been able to score more than that. So I am picking on the offense.
Well, but you can also flip it around and talk about complementary football and say if the offense sustains longer drives and keeps the defense off the field, that minimizes opportunities for Marshall, to score with their offense.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I am picking on the offense. I think it's more their problem than it is the defense, even though the defense gave up 2 95-yard drives to lose both games.
Right.
But the offense is the bigger issue here for me. You have to be able – the buck stops with the head coach. You hired those guys. They need to prepare their players. They clearly weren't prepared. The offensive line wasn't prepared. The wide receivers weren't prepared. The offensive coordinator's game plan wasn't prepared. Like, it was not – there was a lack of preparation, and that falls on the head coach. No doubt about it.
I brought this up yesterday. Like, you can – Tommy Reis is catching even more heat right now than Marcus Freeman because, I think Marcus Freeman, because of the offseason and the top-ranked recruiting class that he had forever, that has carried a lot of weight, and people are still, kind of buying into that. There's at least some people saying, well, it might not be going great right now, but once these guys start getting here and that kind of thing. He's bought a lot of equity with that.
Absolutely.
Tommy Reis is catching a lot of blame because there were a lot of, people who didn't want Tommy Reis to begin with. And we can talk, the head coach has had at least some input on these game plans, like
absolutely
the Ohio State game plan specifically, like they went in with a very specific idea. While Marcus Freeman was not calling plays, he and Tommy Reis, combined minds for what they wanted to do in that game and what kind of personnel they wanted to do. Marcus Freeman wanted to shorten the game and do all those kind of things. The Marshall game, I still have to think he had at least some input, especially like if you go back to, there was all the talk about Tommy Reis's autonomy and the Fiesta Bowl. Oh, you're giving him too much of the reins and all this different stuff. Now, we've obviously seen 3 different completely different game plans. But I guess my point is that I said yesterday, even if Marcus Freeman isn't calling plays and he's not sending personnel units onto the field, from play to play, series to series, once you see what is working and what is not working, the head coach, all he's got to do is tell the offensive coordinator is that's working. I want more of that. That's not working. I want less of that. It's as simple as that. So yeah, while Tommy Reis is the one literally calling the plays and that kind of thing, the head coach still has
No
complete
doubt.
oversight, and complete, the ability to overrule anything and say, this is what I want out
Right.
there. Again, he might not be calling plays, but he can say, this is what I want. This is what I don't want.
I could not agree more. And that's where I have a hard time defending Marcus Freeman and just throwing Tommy Rees under the bus. Yes,
Right.
Tommy Rees is the offensive coordinator. No doubt about it. And Marcus Freeman was a defensive-minded coach. He was always on the defensive side of the ball. I get that
Right.
too. Somebody in the chat the other day said something about, his complete lack of offensive knowledge hurting this team. He doesn't have a complete lack of offensive knowledge. In order to be a successful defensive coordinator, you have to understand offense.
Yes.
Brian told a story a few years ago, last year, whenever, about a coach that he once coached for who was a defensive-minded coach. And he literally wrote a playbook. Like, his coach wrote a playbook, an offensive playbook, and it was basically everything that he had trouble defending as a defensive coordinator, essentially, and turn that into an offense. Defensive coordinators understand offense, okay?
Right.
Like, he gets it. It's like, they don't know. What do we do when we have the ball? I don't know. Like,
right.
It's
like, not
come
like
on,
he's
people.
ignorant of the other side of the ball just because that's, where he happens to be.
So that part's getting way overplayed. But if we are accurate, and I believe we are, that means some of the blame has to fall on him for the offensive struggles. So
yes,
I think it does. And again, he's the head coach. So no matter what happens with this team, it falls on him. But he understands offense. He does see what works and what doesn't work. You've got to stick with it. You have to. And if he's not telling Tommy Rees to stick with what was working with Tyler Buckner, then that's on him.
Yeah.
That's on him. So let's see what he can do with Drew Pine, I guess.
At the end of the day, you're already an 0-2 team. There are 10 games to go in this regular season. Now you've got your number 2 quarterback out there.
Right.
But there was going to be a learning curve for Marcus Freeman.
Sure.
We just didn't know to what extent that learning curve was going to be.
Yeah.
And when you lose to Marshall, again, it becomes pretty glaring pretty quickly what the curve is. And when you make some of those mistakes that you make, but the biggest question is, what's Marcus Freeman going to learn from this? How quickly is he going to be able to turn those lessons into results this season? And then kind of on the back of that, what's it going to mean going forward after this season? Because Marcus Freeman, barring them going 0-12 this year, I can't see Marcus Freeman losing his job this year.
I agree. I think he's a 3-year guy. I mean, a minimum, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the question was, is he in over his head? Is he the right guy for the job? Right? I mean, that was the question. As we sit here today on September 13th, I still think he was the right hire at that time. I do. Yeah. I think he was the right hire. I think he will have success. I did not anticipate this valley this early on the learning curve. I did not. And I'll be the first one to admit it. But the key is he has to learn from this, and we have to see growth, not only from this team, but from him moving forward. I think we will. I don't know how much it's going to be from week 2 to week 3. I hope it's visible and obvious, right? Look, Drew Pine can win a lot of games for this team. He can. He's going to need a running game. He's going to need help up front. That has to get better. No question about it. If that happens, they're going to win games. And then you're going to start to get that goodwill again. And if they can, get Jeremiah Love to commit and, all of these different things, the goodwill will start to come back. But we have to see the progress. So, again, I think he's the right man for the job. Is he in over his head? Maybe in preparation on Saturdays. But everywhere else, I think he's fine. He just has to get better at what he's not doing well right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think, I completely agree with everything that you just said right there. I don't think that we're going to see, and I don't think that we should see Marcus Freeman, booted out the door for losing a couple of games early on. Again, there were going to be some lessons learned on the job. Like I saw it a couple of years ago when Niele Ivey we took over
Sure.
for Muffet McGraw. You're talking
Sure.
about, it's the exact same thing. First-time head coach taking
Right.
over for,
Somebody that was very successful.
Yes.
In her situation, a Hall of Famer.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. And that's what I was going to say. Brian Kelly's not a Hall of Famer, but,
But
he
still.
obviously was the all-time winningest, coach in the history of the program. Whether you agree with, love Brian Kelly or
Hey, look,
but
the latter half of his career at Notre Dame was really good.
Yes. And there were lessons that Neil Ivey had to learn on the job, like game time decisions and a lot of this different stuff. They were a 500 team that first year. Some things got away from her,
Sure,
and some different points, but they went to the Sweet 16 in year number 2 and were an eyelash, basically a steal in a bucket away from going to the Elite Eight, and playing UConn in the Elite Eight last season. So, she was able to learn some lessons right away. Now, women's basketball compared to football, even though women's basketball at Notre Dame has obviously been very successful and won a couple of national championships, the spotlight is obviously much greater on football at Notre Dame. So every little thing that Marcus Freeman did or didn't do was going to be blown up. But when you lose to Marshall, it blows it up, and the spotlight and the glare gets even brighter. I still think that he is a very good coach who essentially has to learn how to become a head coach, but he's learning that on the job now.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And again, way more bumps than I anticipated. No doubt about that. But we had to anticipate some bumps. I just didn't think those bumps would equal a loss, in week 2. I mean, that's the reality of it. And that's the disappointing part of it too, because as we've said many, many times, it's easy to fix the mistakes after you get a W than it is after you take an L. And especially when you take an L by a team you were favored to beat by 3 touchdowns. So, there's a lot riding on Saturday, to be honest with you, more so than just wearing green jerseys. You got to go out and make a statement. And at this point, I'll just take a win.
Yeah, I mean, we already got people complaining about green jerseys for this Saturday as well, who are ready to blame the green jerseys for whatever problems they might have against Cal Saturday. So, and look, I'm not a Brian Kelly apologist by any stretch of the imagination. And Brian Kelly is a really good football coach. Now, you can talk about what he is as a person, all these different things, but I said this going in, when it's easy to write off 42 consecutive wins over non-ranked teams because they're non-ranked teams. You're supposed to win those games, but you're talking about a guy with a ton of experience as a college football head coach, and it might not have looked the prettiest all the time. It definitely didn't look the prettiest in those big games.
Sure.
We know that.
That was the knock.
He won a lot of football games. He figured out a way to win a lot of football games, so love him or not.
Yeah.
A lot of experience, and it took care of that. We're seeing a guy who is not cutting his teeth at Grand Valley State. He's cutting his teeth at Notre Dame.
Or Central Michigan or Cincinnati. I mean, Brian Kelly had the normal stair step to a big time head coach, and Marcus Freeman didn't have that opportunity. And, again, do I think he was the right decision at the time? I still do. Yes.
Me too.
But he's got work to do. I guess that's the best way to put it. He's got work to do, man.
I will say, when you listen to some of these press conferences now, because that was the other thing, that we had touched on every now and then coming into the season, what are those press conferences going to be like when the questions get a little bit tougher and they're not all softballs? And he's gotten some tougher questions, and I have noticed now there's some, he answers different questions differently, but there have been a few more word salads, kind of tossed into the bowl over the last couple of weeks as the questions have become a little bit tougher at times.
I mean, nobody does a word salad like Brian Kelly, but
that's right.
Yeah, I have a feeling he's going to be dancing around because he's not meeting the media today. It's just the coordinators. So I am interested to hear what they have to say as well. But, on Thursday's press conference for Marcus Freeman, they're going to get questions. He's going to get questions about the questions that were asked.
What comes up today?
You know what I mean? So he's going to have there's going to be some interesting responses, I'm sure.
I think so too. Here's what I know, Vince. It's rapid fire time.
Yes. Let's go.
Let's
go.
Okay. So we'll stick on the Marcus Freeman topic. I've heard some people refer to Marcus Freeman's coaching style as, quote, a cheerleader approach. What do you think about that?
That's very interesting. I never really thought of him that way as like a cheerleading coach. He was always kind of
he's out there rah rah and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, yeah. I guess that's kind of a synonym for players coach. You know what I mean? That he kind of he wants what's best for the players, and he's always there, and we're the best friends and making the videos and stuff like that. And I can see that, I guess, but that's more, to me, that's more of his outside the program persona as opposed to what we see at practice. And I think what the players see behind closed doors.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's really how he is with the players, but I do think that is how he's viewed outside of the Goog by a lot of people. So, I mean, I get it. I guess it makes sense, but I don't think that that's really his personality when it comes to teaching the kids how to play the game.
Brian Kelly had very little personal relationships with his players, and he had purple face.
Yeah.
Marcus Freeman has, deep connections with his players. He doesn't have purple face. Some people see him maybe, again, as a little too rah-rah. I think that, one, he's 36 years old, and the trend, this trend has been going on for several years now.
Absolutely.
Younger coaches.
Sean McVay.
Sean McVay, the guy in Miami, I can't think of his name right now, but had a very successful, debut. Even, Sean McDermott in Buffalo, he's young.
Sure.
You look at baseball, like Alex Cora, all these different guys. Younger coaches, deeper connections with the players.
Sure.
Like, like Brian Kelly is like the classic, older school approach,
he's the old guard.
Nose, hands off, like, I played high school sports in the 80s. We virtually had no personal relationships with any of our coaches.
It's true.
Even the assistants, everyone just seemed like much more ancient and older than us. There was never any of that. Everything was, coach them hard nosed, all this kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
It's a lot different now. There are like the interpersonal relationships that Marcus Freeman has. It's like at the one time you're praising him because he's able to go out there and make these connections with high school kids and get these big, high school recruits. But then when you lose a couple of games, well, it's the wrong approach to have.
Right.
You're too close to the players. You're too rah-rah. Like you said, like we've seen him, he was never walking around practice when we were there, rah-rah, hand clapper, cheering, and all that kind of stuff. He was in there, he was in there coaching. And then there were times when we were walking out of practice, I think it was the very first day where, he had to have, kind of a look, guys, we can't have we can't have guys puking and unable to finish practice, at the end of practice. We got to have you here. It's got to be, all those different things. So just because maybe the image that you have is one thing doesn't mean that he's not actually getting his hands dirty in their coaching. So I think it's a mischaracterization of who Marcus Freeman is as a coach. Just because you have good relationships with your players doesn't mean you're not coaching them hard as well.
I completely agree with you. And that's, I never questioned his boundary between being a player's coach and being a coach who is respected, you know, and that's the key. If your players respect you, they're going to listen to you and they're going to learn from you and all of that. And you can still have a relationship with those players. It's a fine line to walk. Don't get me wrong. But I always felt like he walked that line pretty darn well, to be honest with you. And again, even in the Vegas video, they kind of made a joke about it.
Right.
Because, he's doing these like, wait, guys, I'm
your coach, not your friend. Yeah.
Right. I mean, they made a joke about it, but I do think that he does walk that line very well. And it's a fine line, but I think he does a good job with it. I do. So I don't think that that's because again, like you said, you can't have it both ways. He's a dynamic recruiter because he develops relationships with these kids on the recruiting trail. You can't just shut that down when they come on campus.
Right.
I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't, you're here. I'm
Now
not
you're a
talking to
different
you
guy.
anymore.
It's like, oh, you're on my time now, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you can't have it both ways. Otherwise, those guys are gonna be like, you know what? I'm out of here. They're gonna just leave and they're gonna transfer and all of these different things. So I think he does a good job of showing his genuine self to players and prospective players and all of that. But when it's time to be coached, he's a coach and he coaches them up at practice. So
Yep.
I think he does actually a good job of that. Maybe what he's coaching, maybe we got to work on. But other than that, I think he does a good job with that.
Fill in the blank. Notre Dame's goal for the rest of this season is now blank.
Well, I think the goal has to be New Year's 6. Because look, you're going to if you're setting a goal, it's something you want to achieve, right? Is that a realistic goal? I'll let you know maybe Saturday about 7:00 whether that's a realistic goal or not, because I need to see this team play a heck of a lot better than they did last Saturday. And they're going to have to continue getting better and better and better when the likes of the Clemsons and the BYUs and the USCs, et cetera, right? So, but I think as of right now, that has to be your goal. New Year's 6 has to be your goal, because I think realistically a 9-3 or 10-2 team can be a New Year's 6 team, because, they plucked the top 4 teams out of the New Year's 6. And so now you've got other opportunities to get yourself in there. And there's still, it's still Notre Dame. There's still eyeballs. And when they've got at-large opportunities, if a bowl has an opportunity to select Notre Dame, they're going to do it, right? So I think 9-3, 10-2 still get you into a New Year's 6. And I think that's the goal right now.
No, I think you're right about that. But you have 10 games to go, and so the margin for error obviously becomes much more slim. And BYU's looking pretty good. BYU beat Baylor last weekend, and they're looking. That's not a team to be overlooked. So I mean, you definitely have 3 games that are going to be tough.
Absolutely.
On the schedule. To me, it's now this is the floor. The goal for to look like the football team that you thought you were coming into this season, not just to look like it, to play like it, the 2 lines. And I do think that it starts there, especially since that was such a big emphasis for Marcus Freeman coming into this season. They have to look a lot more competent, going back to what we were talking about earlier with what Marcus Freeman and Tommy Rees thought this team was. What's this offensive line right now? Like, we saw this offensive line during camp. It is baffling that line has looked like what it has looked like. And we were all heaping all this praise on Harry Hiestand, and we thought it was deservedly so. But what we've seen from that unit so far has been very disappointing. What we've seen from the defensive line, Al Washington's group, has been very disappointing. So, to me, it starts with that. If you can become more physical and play to a higher standard with both of those lines, both sides of the football, what you were just talking about is going to take care of itself, I think, ultimately.
Yeah.
Now, you can't go out there on Saturday and try to be a smash mouth football team just because that's what you want to do. You have to be realistic with what you are. Maybe you have to, grow to that level. But to me, it starts with that. Play to that standard, on both of those fronts, and the big picture stuff is ultimately going to take care of itself, I think.
No, I like that a lot. And you're absolutely right, because you need to have season-long goals, and you also need to have, shorter-term goals that will get you to your long-term goal, right? And I think that was a great explanation of, okay, we got to do this, and this before we can worry about that, right? So I think that's a really good point. I was looking at it as more like, hey, what's our end goal? But
sure.
you're
I got you.
Yeah, you're 100% right. You've got to do a lot of things in order to get to that point. And again, the margin for error for what I said the goal should be is razor thin. It's razor thin. You have to. Not only do you have to compete in these games, you got to win them. You got to win them if you want that to be your goal. I mean, there's plenty of people out there in the chat and elsewhere. They're going to say, "Oh, the goal is 6-6. It's to be bowl eligible." After what we've seen from the first 2 games, I get where you're coming from. So far, they haven't even shown me that they're even worth being in a bowl, let alone a New Year's 6 bowl. So, is it pie in the sky to think that they're going to make a New Year's 6 bowl? Maybe, especially after what we've seen. But it's still a goal that you can have that is attainable because of what you still have in front of you. That's
Yeah.
my point. You know what I mean? Even if it's lofty, it's still a goal you can achieve if you do everything you need to do.
Yep. Another fill in the blank. Here's a tweet from Drew Tranquil after the loss to Marshall Saturday. Here's what Drew Tranquil said. I remember back in 2018 when we barely beat Ball State. We went on to go 12-0 that year. Today, it's the flip side of the coin. One bad day in the office doesn't have to define the season. Tough times go away. Tough people don't. Embarrassing, but I can't wait to see the response. Vince, that's blank.
100% accurate, because I'm more referring to the last part. I mean, you can't really compare an almost loss, which was a victory, an almost loss, to what happened on Saturday, because
yeah,
you know, we talk about Ball State and we talk about
how
loss, they weren't prepared for it, but they still won the game, right? I mean, so it's hard for me to compare the two because they're not going to go 12-0. At best, they're going to go 10-2, right? So you can't really compare that top stuff. The bottom part of this, I completely agree with you. Tough times go away. Tough people don't. It's embarrassing, but I can't wait to see the response. That part I'm on board with, because I can't wait to see the response as well, because there has to be one. And there's going to be a response. Is it going to be a positive response or is it going to be a negative response? It's going to be one of the two. I can't wait to see the response either. So I think that last part is 100% accurate with what he said.
And you're right about that first part, because you can't compare an almost loss to a loss, because it basically comes down to what we were talking about before. You know, no matter how much you might despise Brian Kelly now, they didn't play to their standard, but they still found a way to win. Notre Dame didn't play to its standard Saturday against Marshall, but they couldn't find a way to win.
Yeah.
Like, the tailspin continued and things got worse. What the response is going to be, I am really, really curious to see, because again,
me too.
We've never seen Marcus Freeman in this situation before, because Marcus Freeman has not been a head coach before. And that's what I do want to see what the response is.
Sure.
Are they going to figure out a way to turn this thing around? Because it's not like it's never happened before, but you know, because we were all here 6 years ago, we saw what 2016 turned into. Now, again, the roster, everything else, there's nothing that points us to saying that's what this is going to turn into, but what is the response going to be? I really do want to see what the response is going to be.
Yes, absolutely. Because there needs to be one. I mean, there needs to be a response, and there's going to be one, but man.
Oh, man.
We'll see.
Okay. Now, this next question is less a question than there's going to be a lot to it. Did you do your homework?
I did. Not as much as I wanted to, but I did do my homework, and I definitely have an opinion.
So we all know NBC. Now, we were at the game Saturday, but we recorded the game on NBC. We have watched parts of it back, more for X's and O's and stuff like that, less for, Jack Collinsworth and Jason Garrett doing the commenting.
Right.
I was going to actually, because of the fact that, they lost to Marshall, I was going to save this for next week. But then Andrew Marchand, who covers sports media for the New York Post and is the co-host of the Marchand and Oran Sports Media podcast, he basically did a review, a critique of the new Jack Collinsworth, Jason Garrett booth. And this is more about Jack Collinsworth than it is Jason Garrett. But so here's what Marchand had to say, and I'll try to kind of go through. Do you want to go through this point by point, or do you want me to kind of like just breeze, get through most of the points and then we can discuss it?
Why don't you breeze through it, and then we'll talk about it at the end.
Okay. So these are Marchand's words on Jack Collinsworth, the 27-year-old Notre Dame grad who is now NBC's Notre Dame football play-by-play announcer. Quote, Jack Collinsworth's last name and the NBC family lineage surely didn't hurt him getting the Notre Dame play-by-play job, but he struggled Saturday as much as the Fighting Irish, who were upset by Marshall. Let's address it all. And again, these are Marchand's words that I'm reading here. 1, this is a big-time role that NBC's president of production, Sam Flood, entrusted to a 27-year-old in Collinsworth. Now he goes on, he talks about how basically Mike Tirico had the job and Tirico moved on. He had Drew Brees last year and that kind of thing. And now the analyst Collinsworth's partner is former Cowboys coach Jason Garrett. And Tirico is now, of course, working with Collinsworth's father,
Right.
Chris Collinsworth. Again, now I'll read this directly. Quote, when you're 27 years old, haven't done a ton of play-by-play, and have a big last name, there's going to be scrutiny and even charges of nepotism. Notre Dame on NBC is not on-the-job training. It is the big leagues. Again, this is from Marchand. 4, Collinsworth didn't sound like a national TV play-by-player. His few reps showed in his lack of command. He had a habit of saying mm-hmm at times and felt a step slow on calls. In the big moments, he didn't exclaim and resonate. He didn't sound like someone who is fully in charge, which makes sense because he lacks play-by-play experience. I'll skip past some of this other stuff where he's talking about, similar guys like Kenny Albert and Joe Buck. They had dads who were in the booth and that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily as relevant, but it's, then he says, Jack Collinsworth is fine as a reporter on NBC's Sunday Night Football. He may not be Bob Costas, but he doesn't feel out of place. On Saturday, Collinsworth failed to tell the stories of Marshall and the upset and connect the right words and tone on the game's biggest plays. The broadcast felt uneven. So those are Andrew Marchand. Again, he covers sports media extensively. He's on top of, all this kind of stuff. What do you think of the review there and that Andrew Marchand gave Jack Collinsworth in his first game?
Well, one of his points, I thought he was a little too nice, to be honest with you, because when he was talking about him being, a reporter for Sunday Night Football, he said he may not be Bob Costas, but he doesn't feel out of place. I still felt like he felt out of place. Like I'm sorry. It didn't, and maybe it's because I've seen him on the Notre Dame broadcasts and maybe I'm biased in a negative fashion because, he got the job working, on the Notre Dame broadcast because of who he is before that. And that's what got him the job on Sunday Night Football.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just never all that impressed with him, even being on the sidelines or at the halftime or pregame or whatever he was doing. Right. So I thought that was nice. I didn't, because I don't feel that way at all. I do think he feels choppy. I do feel like it's inexperience. I mean, that's what it is. And it's nothing against what maybe he will be in 10 years. It's what he is now. And having him be the play-by-play guy for Notre Dame football, which is your flagship college football situation at NBC, and it just felt like an afterthought to me. And I just don't think he carried the torch very well for himself. I just was not all that impressed. And and to kind of escalate that a little bit, the relationship between him and Garrett felt forced. It didn't feel smooth.
Because it is, think of the fact that
Absolutely.
If Mike Tirico was still there, Jason Garrett is now working with one of the best play-by-play announcers in the country who has 3-4 decades of experience doing that job versus a guy who is, not half of his age, but probably a good 20 or so years younger than him and is just as inexperienced as him.
It's two rookies trying to work together. And look, I'd love to go back into the vault and sound, hear what you and I sounded like when we first started, but you were a pro and you were able to bring me along to where now we have a really good working relationship. This is completely different. Like Jack does not have the time under his belt to bring Jason Garrett along. And that's because there's a lot of green color guys that are out there. It's a lot of former athletes or coaches or whatever.
But they're typically, especially if you're jumping into a network booth like this, you are going to have a play-by-play guy who is much more experienced and can basically the play-by-play guy needs to be the point guard, especially on TV. Yes. He needs to be the point guard for the analyst. He needs to set him up on TV. TV is much like we talk about Tony Romo. We talk about Troy Aikman. We talk about all these different analysts on TV. The play-by-play guy, because you have the picture, the play-by-play guy there is there to set up the analyst. On radio, it is 80% the play-by-play guy. The
Mhm.
analyst gets in when he can because the radio guy has to describe as much as possible. Like even
Correct.
Jack Collinsworth, like to me, he talked too much. Like he needed to lay out more often to let Jason Garrett get in and describe more. Like Collinsworth kept there was too much detail basically because we can see what's going on. You know, like there
Right.
was a blitz that Ramon Henderson had. It was like a third down. It
Yep.
basically, third down, Notre Dame brings the heat. Ramon Henderson, that kind of thing because Henderson ended up with the sack. That's what it needed to be. But instead, there was too much and then he would talk after the play, and Jason Garrett doesn't get a chance to get in and really be the analyst. And to me, it had the feel more instead of NBC network TV, it had more a Big Ten network FS1 level quality because of the fact that you're talking about a 27-year-old who literally the most football, as far as I can tell, what I've been able to, the research that I've done, and I, did look around quite a, he's worked at ESPN and some other places, but the most football play-by-play that he had was this past summer when these two guys did USFL games together. He's getting to cut his TV, as Marchand said. This is a big job, but he's getting to cut his teeth doing Notre Dame football on NBC. Now,
Absolutely,
he's good enough, and if good enough is what the Notre Dame job on NBC shouldn't be about good enough. It should be about you should have think about the people who have sat in that seat before. It's not good enough.
No, I completely agree with you, and they were rookie mistakes. You know what I mean? Because it's different. Like you said, it's different to call radio versus TV. And it felt like he was calling radio as opposed to TV. It's a completely different feel to it, but it's still, even saying that, it still felt choppy to me.
Yeah.
It just felt choppy. And if you're a rookie color guy, you need a veteran play-by-play guy to pull you along and help you out and get you into where you need to get your points in and all of that. Like, and even then it takes
but Collinsworth
time
is trying to figure that out himself right now.
Exactly. And that's the problem. You've got two rookies learning on the job. That doesn't work. It doesn't work.
And you're right. Maybe 10 years down the line, he's going to end up being a really good play-by-play guy, or even 5 years down the line or whatever. But he should be cutting his teeth over on, doing ESPN Plus game, and that's, I would compare it to that as well, because ESPN Plus even has, like student quality, student broadcasters a lot of times. It's just like, this is a guy who hasn't gone out and cut his teeth in a place where basically nobody cares. Like when I was coming through college and we, learning play-by-play and all this stuff, I can't think of his name right now. The guy who used to do college football for ABC. Why can't I think of his name? Basically, he talked to one of our classes one time, and he basically, the basic gist of what he was saying is you've got to go out, you've got to go off the grid, and you cut your teeth. You get your reps in places that there aren't a whole lot of people paying attention. But that's not what, Jack Collinsworth is cutting his teeth on national TV right now. And all of his mistakes are going to be there every week for people. And if this season keeps spiraling the way that it's spiraling right now, Keith Jackson. I don't know why I couldn't think. I was thinking granddaddy of them all and all these different things, but I couldn't think of.
I was going to ask you if that's who it was, but yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. And he got the job because of who. I look, when it comes to nepotism, quote unquote, and getting a job because of who your parents are, I don't necessarily have a problem with that if you are good at your job. I mean, some people have an in because of who their parents are. That's just a fact, no doubt about it. But I want you to be good at your job too, and a lot of career moves and stuff are all about opportunity. And sometimes you can get different opportunities based on who you are. It is what it is. Tori Spelling had a great career because of who her dad was. You know what I mean? I don't know why I came up with that, but that was what came into my head. So yes, it can open doors for you, but you shouldn't get jobs you don't deserve and aren't good at.
Well, and that's, there was a lot of criticism of Joe, but, there's always been criticism of Joe Buck, but that was a criticism of him, getting a network job early on as well. But Joe Buck, he didn't walk into the number one booth,
right?
Even because he had that name, Jack, and being the son of Jack Buck, he didn't walk into that number one booth right off the street. He cut his teeth. He did other things, and even when he got the first network job, he wasn't front and center on that network right away. He grew into that, turned into the number one guy. Basically, he earned his stripes. He proved that he deserved to be there. Maybe Collinsworth does that, but I agree with Marchand. Right now, he just doesn't have that authoritative voice in this booth. Like between the two, I'm not the biggest Jason Garrett fan because of my Cowboys background, but between the two, Jason Garrett did the better job. Because he knows his stuff when it comes to football.
Exactly. And that's what you want from a color guy, you know? So I will say the bar is set lower for a color guy than it is for a play-by-play guy, just because
you expect that
the job
he's the jock, and you know that he's going to have to learn on the job.
Absolutely correct. I expect not perfection, but I expect, professionalism and all of that from an experience from my play-by-play guy. Yeah. So it's disappointing, but it is what it is, I guess.
I mean, we'll see. We'll check in on
hopefully
this
he gets better.
Season. Yeah, we'll check at the end of the season. See how it goes.
The parallels between Marcus Freeman getting a job without the experience and Jack Collinsworth getting the job without the experience and it being Notre Dame. Believe me, the parallels are not lost on me right now.
True. Very true.
Hopefully they both get better by the end of the season.
Yes. Exactly. All right, so last night's Monday Night Football game had another rookie head coach. The Broncos were trailing 17-16, a little bit more than a minute to play in the fourth quarter. So they're down by a point. Russell Wilson completes a short pass. They end up with the ball at the Seattle 46. They had all three timeouts. It's 4th and 5. Rather than go for it, try to convert the first down with all three timeouts and, maybe set up a manageable field goal, Broncos rookie head coach Nathaniel Hackett lets the game clock wind all the way down to 20 seconds before finally calling a timeout. And then he brings Russell Wilson off the field and they try a 64-yard field goal to try to win the game. The field goal, of course, misses. So do you buy or sell that as the right call, Vince?
That was literally the worst thing that you could have done in that particular scenario. The worst thing you could have possibly done. Number one, the third down got over with about 50 seconds to go, I want to say. First of all, you're going to call timeout right then and there, okay?
Right.
So you at least have 50 seconds to work with. Second of all, I'm going for it on 4th and 5 because if you get it, you're still in the ball game. You still have probably over 40 seconds to play. And you still have 2 timeouts, okay?
Right.
If you don't get it, you turn the ball over. They're just going to put knees on it. It's game over anyway, okay? Or you turn it over. You still have 2 timeouts. Oh, man, maybe you get the ball back. You never know. But the bottom line is you call timeout right away. You go for it. I trust Russell Wilson. He's the 10-year veteran who's made a lot of fourth quarter comebacks. I trust him to get a 4th and 5, if I'm being honest. And then you've got the whole rest of the way to go. You need probably another 10 yards for a makeable field goal, and then you go from there. The worst thing you could have possibly done is let the time tick all the way down and try to kick a 64-yard field goal with a kicker who hasn't kicked over 50 yards in 6 years.
I guess it just dawned on me. Brian's the Broncos fan. We should have had him on here.
Oh.
It's not, but it's you just you mentioned Russell Wilson. You just got Russell Wilson in the offseason, and now he's back in his old stomping grounds. He's the guy with you got him for that situation. That's why you got Russell Wilson, not to try to kick a 64-yard field goal. And then after they miss the field goal and Seattle gets the ball back, then Hackett decides when Geno Smith is taking a knee, now he's going to start using his timeouts. Like what is that? What are you accomplishing by calling timeout in that? It's ridiculous that you would rather put the game on the foot of a no-name kicker than put the ball in Russell Wilson's hands with all 3 timeouts, Let him try to get a first
Yeah.
down. And again, at the very worst case, if you get a first down, you're trying a shorter field goal. It made absolutely zero sense to me that was your answer, a 64-yard field goal.
And I'm watching the Manning cast at the end of the game, and Peyton Manning is up in the corner. You know, they've got him like, you know, just their heads or whatever. And he's like, you got timeout. And he's just going like the other guys are talking, and he's just going like this over and over and over again.
Right.
It's like, why are you not calling timeout? It was unfathomable to me that he didn't call timeout. It's like, what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
I didn't get it. That felt too obvious to me, which is why it's so hard to watch.
You know, and again, like if Notre Dame had lost the Marshall game and we substituted
like
Marcus Freeman for Nathaniel Hackett, like if Marcus Freeman had made this kind of decision, then we're having a different conversation today about whether or not this guy is suited to be a head coach.
100%.
I think, right?
100%. Absolutely. If it came down to a decision like that, you're like, what are you doing? Like you don't need to be there. You don't need to be there.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that would have been horrible. Yeah, it would not have been a good look.
Yep. All right, last question tonight. Albert Pujols plans to retire at the end of the season. As we speak, he currently has 697 home runs.
And he's been on fire lately.
He has. So maybe, this question is going to be moot by the end of the week, but we are sitting here, in the middle of April right now. Let's say the season ends and he's sitting on 699 home runs. Should Pujols come back for one more year if he's sitting on 699 at the end of the season?
Kind of like Mr. 3000. You come back to get your 3 hits or whatever it was because they took.
I think Siri wants to chime in on this. She was just talking.
It's funny. I mean, it's a number or whatever, but to say that you had 700 home runs in Major League Baseball, that'd be a pretty cool number to achieve. I would talk to the Cardinals like, hey, how about you let me be your DH for a few games until I get that one home run or whatever.
And then I'll retire.
And then I'm out. I will, head off into the sunset, whatever. Maybe I'm being petty when it comes to the number or whatever, but when you're so close to kind of a milestone like that, it'd be hard to walk away with 699. It just would for me. I don't know. I think you should consider it.
Yeah. Or, maybe he just, like DHs for home games or something.
Yeah.
Like something like that. I think he's going to end up, like you said, the way he's swinging the bat right now, he's got 2 weeks to do it. All he needs is 3 more home runs, but who knows? Maybe the pressure gets to him a little bit. I don't think I could walk away, especially, he's 42 years old, allegedly. There've always been those rumors that maybe he's older than what he says that he is. But to sit on 699 after the career that he had, I think you've got to come back if he doesn't get to 700. Yeah. Baseball is such a numbers-driven game, especially with those home runs. And he's a guy who has never been linked to steroids as well. I don't think that you could walk away. And, if he were to come back, even the way he's swinging the bat right now, even if he does get over 700, I would think that there would be some incentive to try to be the guy, to say, because the other guys who have passed that 715, they have not been, they have not been free of the PED allegations. Yeah. I guess let's put it that way.
Absolutely. No, that's a good point. That's a good point, which makes it even better. He could be
the clean guy.
Yeah, I would consider it. Why not? I mean, the Cardinals are usually in contention. So, I mean, I know every roster spot is legit and you need every roster spot. So, I mean, there is that. It'd be one thing if he was like playing for the Pirates or something, but so, I mean, that has to be taken into consideration. Well, that's the thing too. Like, would it be with the Cardinals?
Yeah, right. Would they want him back and all those different kind of things?
I will also say that if it's either retire as a Cardinal and not get to 700 or come back next year with like the Marlins or something like that, I'm retiring as a Cardinal. So I put that caveat on it.
It would have to be the situation. Yeah. Like, if it's the Yankees.
Right.
Like you even, and not the Cardinals, because like if he goes to New York, he's going to have a chance to hit Mondo home runs and, all that.
It's true.
Yeah. Like if you're going to come back with the Pirates or the Marlins, that's a different situation.
Exactly. I would want to, if I'm Albert, I want to retire as a Cardinal because that's where he kind of made his name and his hay and all that. Yeah. I would want to retire as a Cardinal. It's why he came back to St. Louis in the first place. So if they're not open to it, then it is what it is. I didn't do what I needed to do in the amount of time that I had. So,
all right, Vince. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up. I got to get heading out over to Notre Dame because, again, we've got those post-practice interviews. Tommy Reese, Al Golden are both going to be coming out. Drew Pine's going to be out for that matter as well. So we've got kind of a who's who out there.
That's right.
Tonight.
But let me know how that goes, buddy.
All right.
Okay, and that is going to do it for that part of the show. We do have a super chat, I think a couple super chats and a couple questions, so we'll get to those before we get out of here. And these first super chats from Jason Warnock. Luke Fickell was my personal preference, but I think Marcus Freeman was a good choice because I wasn't a fan of others available. The optics of Reese was my biggest problem, and he appears overrated. I'm not going to try to convince anyone of the opposite view of that because right now, Notre Dame is 0-2 and is averaging 12.5 points a game. So he's got to go out there and get the job done. Simple as that. And there was a conversation going on during the chat about how many people they interviewed. I don't know how many people they officially interviewed, but I definitely know for a fact Jack Swarbrick talked to at least 3 other coaches that I know by name. I can only name Fickell as the one because that's the only one that I've been given the permission to say publicly, and of course it was already made public, but there was definitely at least for I know for a fact 2 other on top of Fickell current power 5 head coaches that got spoken to by Jack Freeman to some degree. So there were several other people that got interviewed for that job. We also have a question here from Will E. What needs to happen at Notre Dame to return to its former glory? This is a very interesting question. I mean, I think it's kind of it's simple, but it's not. Like the formula is simple, but it's hard to kind of get all the pieces in place. Number one, I think you need to hire a dynamic head coach. Dynamic for me is all encompassing. It's dynamic from a personality standpoint, dynamic from a coaching standpoint, meaning you are able to get the most out of your teams, dynamic from a psychological standpoint. A big part of being a head coach is being able to know how to deal with people's psyche, get people's heads right, get people, getting 85 players and 10 other coaches and 100 support staff people all going in the same direction requires some mastery that takes time. Lou Holtz obviously had a lot more time doing that, for example. It requires someone who's a dynamic recruiter. I think that's as important at Notre Dame, even more so than other places. I think it requires a lot of support from the administration, which for the most part we're getting at Notre Dame. I can't really complain a ton about that. There's some things certainly Notre Dame can and should do better, but they've been doing a lot better in those instances and in most of the cases over the especially the last 4 or 5 years for sure. And then I think it's just about putting the head coach, surrounding himself by really good people. I think if you look at Lou Holtz's tenure, you look at his first 4 years at Notre Dame, first 5 years at Notre Dame, 5, 6 years at Notre Dame, and then his last 5 years at Notre Dame, the coaching staffs he had were significantly better early on, especially from a coordinator standpoint. There's some good assistants on his later years. He had Charlie Strong and Urban Meyer, but as from a coordinator and then just top down, he just wasn't surrounded by as many good people, and he wasn't getting support from the school, which is, you can tell from the results, those 2 things were true, and you could tell them by the results. So I think all those things are part of it. It's about getting great players and having a great staff and a head coach who's dynamic. I think that's really what it comes down to, in my opinion. Let's go to Jeff Brown. The learning curve is much steeper than I thought it would be. In retrospect, it might be too much of a learning curve to be the head coach of a place like Notre Dame. We'll see. Honestly, what's kind of interesting is, look, there's a learning curve. There's always going to be a learning curve. Learning curve doesn't justify a loss to Marshall. That's something that's got to get corrected. The problem is that the biggest problem that Notre Dame has right now I'm trying to think of there's a toxicity around the program and it's around all programs when they struggle. And that's kind of my frustration for with fans is we can be upset with what we've seen. We should be. Notre Dame fans should not be okay with losing to Marshall in no circumstance. I'm the biggest Marcus Freeman supporter out there, still am. But that doesn't mean that you say, it's okay if you lost to Marshall. It's not okay. But there's not okay with it. And then there's jumping off the deep end and creating a toxic environment. And the reality is fans don't realize the power that they have for the program that they support. They don't realize the benefits that they can have if they are doing things the right way. And they don't sometimes even understand the negativity they can have on a program, the toxicity that they can create, because it's what players see. It's what recruits see, especially now in this era of social media. It's especially true. So when you have, I've seen hundreds of fans, fire him and fire this guy and fire that guy. Stuff doesn't help. And there's a way to be critical without kind of jumping off the deep end like some people have. Every Notre Dame fan, in my opinion, should be critical of what we saw on Saturday. Everyone. But there's a way to be critical in a way that shows, hey, we still got your back. Let's see what you do. Now, there comes a point in time where it's like, okay, we've seen enough. But it's not game 2. It's not going to be game 3 of a coach's beginning tenure. And I just, and it's the same attitude I had when Brian Kelly started 4 and 5. He needed way more time. And eventually you got to the point years later, you're like, okay, this is who he is. And a change needed to be made. But we can be critical, but also not turn it into what we have seen the last several days. And I get it on Saturday and Sunday. People are upset. But I feel like that's one of my frustrations with fans, to be completely honest with you. So I think we need to make sure that we're doing our part as well, in my opinion. All right, so let's get down to some more questions. Adam Shipley, how much do we see Angeli? Honestly, when I look at this, I hope that we see Steve Angeli Saturday, because if we see Angeli Saturday, then that means Notre Dame. Well, let me rephrase that. I hope we see Angeli late in the game Saturday, because that hopefully in a circumstance where Notre Dame has a big lead, it would be really bad for Notre Dame and for Steve Angeli to throw him into a situation where his first real snaps are if Drew Pine gets hurt or is ineffective. That would be terrible. And if you're a Steve Angeli supporter, you better hope that Drew Pine comes out and lights the world on fire on Saturday, and that Notre Dame gets a big lead and he can go out and get some snaps this week. And then if his time comes down the road, he's got a chance to come in and get some real playing time and not just be thrown into the fire. That would be really bad, because one of the things that people talk about with Tommy Rees is as a player, well, they don't talk about it as much as they should, but that it was talked about in the past was, hey, this kid came off the bench and rallied Notre Dame to 4 straight wins as a true freshman. But sometimes what we forget is that was not the first time that we saw Tommy Rees getting significant action in 2010. And that actually came earlier in the season against Michigan, when Dane Chris got hurt and they brought in Nate Montana, and Nate Montana didn't play very well, and they had to bring in Tommy Rees after that. And I'm trying to remember how much Tommy Rees actually played, but I know he played against Michigan that game. And I'm going to pull up the box score now from 2010, but I remember Tommy came into that game and played in that game. And then, of course, Dane Chris came back and got hurt again later, and Tommy Rees was able to kind of step into the spotlight. Yeah, Tommy came in, threw 2 passes, got intercepted. That was his first action. And then, of course, you kind of saw what happened next. He came in later in the year and obviously performed a lot better, but he had gotten some opportunities that season to come in off the bench. He came in against Michigan, didn't play well. Comes in later against Navy after they were getting blown out, goes 6 of 7 for 79 yards. Then, of course, he comes against Tulsa and throws 3 interceptions. So, yes, Tommy Rees led them to a 4-0 record, but he played in 3 losses earlier in the year. And those struggles coming off the bench helped get him ready to then go lead the team to 4 wins. And so I would love to see Steve Angeli get a chance to actually play before he's thrust into a situation where he has to kind of go be the guy without ever having played really any real snaps. So that would be a concern for me. There's no doubt about it. All right, let's get to some more questions here. Connor Nepper says, what are the top 3 things we need to see on Saturday? So, Connor, this is a really good question. And 2 of them, one of them I'm not going to talk about a ton because it's what our show is going to be about tomorrow. But I would encourage you, if you haven't already done so, listen to our show today, because I think one of the things that I think need to happen, they kind of go hand in hand on offense, we discussed today. There's a lot of things on offense that need to happen. But if I were to kind of narrow it down into one, and it's sort of, I can't even just do one, it's 2 things that go into one. Offensively, you need personnel and attitude changes. I think the offense as a whole needs to play with more urgency, a little bit more fire, a little bit more pep in their step. I think it's important. And I also think there are players that are not playing right now that need to play, or guys that aren't necessarily in leading roles that need to be in more leading roles from a touches standpoint. And so that is kind of where I would be when it comes to the changes need to be made on that side of the ball. Defensively, we'll talk about this a lot more tomorrow, but they need to scale back the defense. That's a big thing defensively that needs to happen right now. And then the third thing is from a leadership standpoint, from the player level, they need to step up and say, hey, look, we're not going to stand for this. And for me, when I look at this Notre Dame football team and I look at past Notre Dame football teams that were able to kind of overcome some coaching issues in the past, a lot of what they did was you had leadership that said, this isn't a problem, or this is a problem and this isn't acceptable. This is not going to happen under our leadership. And they went out and did what they needed to do to fix it. And in spite of the coaches at times. And so I think that's something that I look at and say that needs to be part of this too. The players need to stop. And I'm not saying they're doing this. I'm saying if they're doing this, they need to stop kind of looking around for other things and look inside and say, hey, we have control of this. And I don't care what the coaches call. I don't care this. We're Notre Dame. That's Marshall. We're Notre Dame. That's Cal. We got to go out and do what we need to do. And that's something that comes from leadership, from a player standpoint. And so there's things the coaches need to do, which I talked about first and second. And then third is the players got to step up and say, yeah, let's do it. Because it's never just coaches. It's never just players. It's never either one of those. And it's always both. I think it can vary to degrees who's responsible for certain things that don't go correct. But it's never just one or the other. It's always both to some degree. And that needs to get corrected, in my opinion. We are not Marshall, says Sean and Vince. Which unit makes the most impact this weekend, defense or punt, kickoff, return units? Obviously, Sean and Vince are not going to be able to answer that because that was a recorded aspect of the show, but I'll answer it, and it better be the defense, because I think the defense this week has an opportunity to put the offense in some really favorable situations. The defense has done a really good job of making stops to keep the other team off the board, but they haven't done a good job of making stops in ways that are giving the offense a ton of good field position at times. So no turnovers. Notre Dame is still yet to force a turnover. Give your offense a spark is something you can do. Now, the defense shouldn't have to do that, but the reality is that's where we are. They have to do that. So, and until they do, then, that's just going to be the reality of the situation. Here's an interesting, fun question from Sean Paulus. Sean, I like this one. He says, what is your perfect combo for play-by-play and analyst for a Notre Dame game? For me, if I was NBC or it was up to me, or better yet, here's one. If Notre Dame ends up going with Fox, and one of the deals is Notre Dame gets to pick its own home game crew. So this is the crew that does all the Notre Dame home games. I wish they'd do all the games, but Notre Dame home games. It would be Gus Johnson as the play-by-play and Brady Quinn as the color guy. It would have to be at Fox. You're not bringing them over to NBC. So if Notre Dame were to get a new TV deal, I'd say go to Fox and part of your deal, negotiate having Gus Johnson and Brady Quinn doing all your home games. I think that'd be – and some people are going to love that because they love Gus Johnson. Other people don't like Gus. I don't know why, but I love listening to the games that Gus Johnson does. And I think him and Joel Klatt do a really nice job. But again, I'm okay having a Notre Dame guy in the booth, because the thing about Brady Quinn is definitely going to have a pro Notre Dame slant. But Brady Quinn doesn't strike me as someone who's going to take some of these absurd homer stances that we see from other places. I think Brady is someone who's going to be reluctant, being really harshly critical of his alma mater, but he's also not afraid to point out issues from a football standpoint, right? So it's like he'll point out, hey, the offense is struggling and here's why, without saying like Tommy Rees stinks and he needs to be fired and all this other kind of stuff. So I think he'll bring some passion for Notre Dame to the table, but also keep it about football and keep it football related. And I think he's gotten much, much better at doing that over the years. And so I think he would do a really good job there. And then of course you'd have Gus, who would bring a ton of energy to the table as the play-by-play guy. I would absolutely love that. So that'd be a lot of fun. A lot of fun. All right, let's get to some more questions. Irish Chi-Town. Brian, who are your Super Bowl picks after week 1? And then I responded by saying, I don't really follow the NFL, so I couldn't really tell you. To which somebody else responded, I had to bring this up because this was such a great response. Jean Bay said, just try and one-up Desmond Howard's playoff picks. Worst case scenario, it generates clicks. So I will say this. I do think that I could probably make Super Bowl prediction that's going to have a better shot at, well, and I'll say this, I'll go AFC and NFC title game representative. So then it's kind of like, 14 playoff. And I think I'd have a better shot at being accurate than Desmond Howard did with his college football playoff picks, which were just blatantly absurd. So I'm going to go with for the AFC playoff, I'm going to go with, it's going to be easy to me. It's going to be the Chiefs and the Bills are going to play in the AFC Championship. And I think this year the Bills get it done and beat Pat Mahomes. They've played in some great games. That's my pick for this year. I think the Bengals are going to be in contention, but I just think the Bengals kind of just had a year where everything kind of went right last year. But I'm going to go with the Bills in the AFC beating the Kansas City Chiefs. For the NFC, that's a really good one. I'm going to go Tampa Bay and the Rams. I know the Rams lost their opener in pretty bad fashion, but it was to the Bills. But I'm going to go with the Rams and Buccaneers play, and I just have a hard time betting against Tom Brady. Just, someone have to go there, and I think they made some good changes. Plus, I would love to see Robert Hainsey as a starter for the Bucs get to the Super Bowl as a starter, not just as a backup this time. So that'd be a lot of fun. All right, here's down here from Cole Barker. Coach, do you think you might have over-evaluated or trusted the evaluations too much on some of these guys? Cole, I'm not sure what you're referring to. I have no problem answering the question, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. Over-evaluated or trusted the evaluations too much on some of these guys. If you could just kind of, as I answer some other questions, Cole, just let me know what specifically you're referring to, and then I'll gladly answer your question. I got another one from Sam Tyrell. He said, Brian, would BK be 0-2 if he were coach? So first of all, it'd be easy for me to say yes, to take a shot at Brian Kelly. It'd be easy for me to then, or to go different, say no, because Brian Kelly was successful and he hasn't been 0-2 since 2011. But I can't remember if it was Vince, Sean, or Ryan. I can't remember which one of them said it to me, but they said the reality is this team actually isn't playing much worse than it played last year. I would somewhat disagree with that specifically because I do think the offense at least played well at times last year. In the first 2 games, I mean, they had their moments. They did score 32 points against Toledo. They did score 41 against Florida State. But the counter argument is, well, it's not tit for tat as bad as they were last year, but they were better on offense in the first 2 games than they were on defense. The defense really struggled in the first 2 games. Defense gave up over 30 points in the first 2 games. So that's a good point. But the reality is that the difference in the last 2 years is the quality of the opponents. And that's a very fair point. And, what that means is basically if Notre Dame would have played Ohio State last in the opener and played the same way they did against Florida State, they're 0-1 and probably get blown out. If Notre Dame played Marshall last year in the second, a team like Marshall in the second game as opposed to Toledo, it's a good chance they lose that game too. Because Toledo wasn't very good last year. They lost to Colorado State, who was terrible the next week. Their wins were over Ball State, UMass, Norfolk State, Western Michigan was a good win. Bowling Green stunk, Ohio stunk, and Akron stunk. They really didn't beat anybody worth a darn last year except for Western Michigan, which was a really good win. So, you lost by 16 to Colorado State a week after you lost to Notre Dame. Notre Dame's margin of victory over Toledo was the same as Eastern Michigan's was, and less than what Middle Tennessee's margin of victory was. So, but that's still projection. I don't know what the team would be right now if Brian Kelly was the head coach. I have no idea. All I know is they didn't play that well last year. I expected Marcus Freeman to fix those things. I didn't support Marcus Freeman being the coach so he could keep doing what Brian Kelly did, even if what Brian Kelly would have done was that. It's supposed to be better. Now, I'm not jumping off the train because they started 0-2. It's not acceptable. There's nobody at Irish Breakdown that I'm aware of. Perhaps I haven't heard somebody say something or I missed something. But there's nobody at Irish Breakdown saying what we've seen the first 2 weeks is acceptable. Nobody. I've had people leave my site because they said I was too critical of Marcus Freeman and of the program after the first couple of games. That's fine. But there's a difference between being critical and jumping off a cliff the way that some people have jumped off a cliff. That's what we're not going to do. And to create that kind of toxic type of situation. And so I think you should be able to do both. You should be able to point out criticism without just going insane with it about firing this person, that person, the other. It's just not helpful. Doesn't do anything. And, it doesn't do anything. And it's not professional. It just becomes like, this just be like a fan site, like just a couple dudes that have a fan page and they just rant and rave and say insane things. We're not going to do that. We vented. Now we're going to try to offer solutions. And if those solutions get addressed, this team will start winning again. If they don't, they won't start winning. And we'll have a whole different conversation at that point in time. So this isn't one of those support no matter what blind faith things, but it's a case to be critical, but also saying, but I still believe that this was the right hire, and let's give an opportunity to go show it. I do think there is merit to that. And that wears out in time. It's just not wearing out after 2 games of his first season. That's where I'm coming from at this point in time. Got another one down here. This is a good one from Joe H. Brian, do you have a new projected win-loss record after the Marshall loss? I don't. Joe, at this point in time, I don't have a clue what this team is. I don't. I break down these 2 games and I see so many opportunities for this team to be 2-0. Not just 1-1, but 2-0. But I can't point a finger to why these things aren't being fixed. And so I can tell you what needs to be fixed, but I don't have a lot of confidence right now in what will be fixed just because this is still so new. It's like we said last week. Al Golden did a great job in the opener against Ohio State. But what we don't know is, can he put a game plan together in a week? I think to a degree he did okay, but I think they just out-talented Marshall in when they talks about like stopping Marshall. I don't think Notre Dame necessarily did anything schematically to stop Marshall the way that they did Ohio State. I think their players were just way better than Marshall's players, and they were able to make stops because Marshall had some misses as well. And so I don't think he put a good game plan together in week 2. I think there are things that need to get corrected and fixed. And so the point being, there's still so much we don't know about this team. I don't know how they're going to respond. You do your offseason projection and then you say, okay, now let's see. Because what do we always say? We said it all summer. This is what I think. This is my projection, but now they got to go show it. Well, so far they haven't shown it, or they've shown something, but it's not what we thought they could be. At this point in time, Joe, I need to see them win a game first. Let me see how they handle these next 2 games going into the bye. And I think that's going to give us a much better sense of where this team is kind of going into the last 8 games, which is going to say, hey, is this a team that can run the table and go 10-2? Is this a team that's going to do well? They're going to beat teams they're supposed to again, but they're not going to beat Clemson and USC. Is it a team that's going to keep losing games they shouldn't, and they're talking about 6-6? There's still so much that I don't know, but right now all I know is this is an 0-2 football team that is not going to beat a lot of teams on their schedule if they play like they did against Marshall. I also don't anticipate them playing like they did against Marshall. That rarely happens. Teams go up or down one way or the other. So for me, I just can't go there yet. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. All right, we got one from Cole Barker. Says, if I had to narrow it down, the O-line, Zeke, Lugg, and Fisher look bad on film. Am I wrong? No, you're not wrong. They do look bad on film. As far as to your earlier question, the misevaluation, I don't think it's a misevaluation because the impressions that we had on them were based on things we've seen. So you say, oh, did you misevaluate? Well, misevaluate based on what? I mean, did you watch Blake Fisher in a game and a half last year? He's a pretty good player. What we've seen from Blake Fisher as a sophomore is not as good as what he showed as a freshman. It'd be one thing, Cole, so like if we were talking about a guy that had never played before or a guy that had never played a meaningful snap and say, hey, I'm basing this off of, okay, so here's a perfect one. So in today's show on offense, I'm saying, hey, Tobias Merriweather needs to play. He needs to do this, he needs to do that. That's me basing that off what I believe his talent level is. It's an evaluation that I'm making based on things not related to what he's done on the football field at Notre Dame. And so it is a projection. And if he goes out and plays and he's not very good and can't get separation and can't catch the ball, then that's a bad evaluation. What we're talking about with like Zeke and Lugg and Fisher is, can you get to the point where you are able to play to your best all the time? Josh Lugg was significantly worse the first 2 games this year than he was the first 2 games last year. Is that due to him just not getting any better? Is he not comfortable at guard, which would surprise me? What's the reason? I don't know what the reason is, but I didn't misevaluate Josh Lugg because he's worse than he was. Same thing with Zeke Correll. Zeke Correll was a projection, but it was, where do you go? Do you look at the guy that was a center in the spring game and did really well, a guy that was a center in 2020 and had some good moments, especially against North Carolina, or do you evaluate the guard who last year was not very good? So it was a projection. I don't say a bad evaluation. I think Zeke has ability. He's just not playing the game the right way. And that's really what it comes down to for me too, Cole, is if a guy plays the game the way he's supposed to play and he's just not good, then you can say, hey, bad evaluation, that guy's not a good player. And there are guys like that. But when you watch a guy play and you say, I still can't determine if this guy's any good or not because I'm watching him and he's stopping his feet. He's not using his hands. They're blowing assignments. That's not so much a talent thing as an execution thing. And that's why I think Marcus Freeman keeps using that. So I don't know if I would say that I missed the evaluation yet. If it continues to happen, then sure, absolutely. I think where I was wrong was thinking that this could get fixed quickly. That's where obviously the misevaluation was, is thinking that this could all come together enough to win games early. And honestly, but it should have. There's no excuse to lose to Marshall. None. I don't care how many guys are playing new positions. I don't care how young you are. None of those things should matter, honestly. They haven't gotten the job done. Simple as that. And you can call it misevaluations or whatever you want to be. The fact is, it's not good enough, and it needs to get better. There's no doubt about it. All right, here we go. See if we got any more questions over here. So let's see here. Sam Tyrell, Brian, what facet of Freeman's in-game coaching would you like to see improved during the Cal game? Sam, if you listen to this show, you know that that's something that I think it's way overplayed. I do not think a head coach's primary job is what he does on Saturday. What would you want Marcus Freeman to have done differently against Cal? You want him to yell at players more? Do you want him to punch somebody on the sideline and being hyperbolic? What do you want him to do? What was the call, right? I loved every 4th down play call they had. You're trusting your offensive line with all your highly ranked players and your big backs and your, legendary O-line coach to be able to just run the ball on 3rd and 2 and 4th and 1 against Marshall. Should he not have done that? He absolutely should have done that. And so to me, the issues are not so much what's happening on Saturday from a head coaching standpoint. It's clearly whatever they're doing is not getting these players ready for Saturday. And that happens from Monday to Friday. I think that's where the disconnect is for me. The game plan gets put together on Monday to Friday, Sunday to Friday, really. The practice preparation, the checks, the audibles, all the rotations, all those different things are determined before the game starts. If those things are broken by the time the game starts, you're going to be in trouble no matter what you do in game. So I just don't know if I can look at that and say Freeman should have done this differently. I also think that he is allowing his coaches to coach. As a former coach, I have always believed in that. If you hired me to do a job, let me do the job. And then if I'm not getting the job done, then step in. What I don't want to have happen is Freeman kind of just always being on the headset telling people what to do or not to do, like he's Lou Holtz, who had been a head coach for a long time before all that happened. So I think for me, that's where I look at it, Sam, and say, what facets of his in-game coaching would I like to see improved? I don't really have a lot of in-game stuff that needs to be improved. What needs to be improved is the Monday to Friday stuff. That's where the changes need to happen, because whatever's happening Monday to Friday is not getting this team emotionally ready to play against Marshall. Did not. I think they were emotionally ready to play against Ohio State. They just didn't execute. They were not emotionally ready to play against Marshall. That's somewhat understood to a degree, but that's also got to be about the players. Like emotionally ready to play, it should not be about the coaches. That should be about the players. But there is a role the coaches play. It's just that no matter what the coaches do, if you have good leadership, they're going to be ready to play. The problem on Saturday was some of the biggest issues Notre Dame had was from their veterans and from their leaders. And that's a problem. So there's an accountability thing lacking that needs to get corrected from top down, from Marcus Freeman on down. And I think those things need to get fixed more. And those are not really, Sam, Saturday things. Saturday is a byproduct of what happens Monday to Friday. And I've always believed that. So Cole says, I'm not blaming you at all. I know expectations were high with these guys. I guess it's more a question for the coach. Cole, I didn't take it that way. I didn't take it that way at all as blaming. I was just trying to I was trying to put into context that I just don't know if what we've seen can be viewed as a misevaluation of talent is all. So I didn't take it that way at all. I thought it was a very fair question. And look, the reality is, when you do what we do, you make predictions. You say, hey, this guy's good, or we think this guy's going to be good, or this coach is good, and this is what I think the record is going to be. And that's what, then if we're not correct on those things, then just like we're going to hold the coaches accountable for saying things that aren't there, you all are allowed to ask, well, hey, what did you see from this team that made you think they'd be a playoff team? Because it was a week ago today that we were on these shows saying, hey, I think Notre Dame's going to run the table. I really believe that. Well, clearly they didn't. They couldn't even be Marshall. It's okay to say, hey, man, got that one wrong. What happened? Just like we're going to say things about the coaches. So I'm good with your question. I just didn't understand the first part of it. And the second part of it, I was just trying to put into context. I don't know if I'm ready to say it's a misevaluation yet. It's just more so I need to see more of it. And again, it comes down to, like, when you see a guy play and he's not doing anything wrong fundamentally or technically, and he's just not making plays, then you can say I was wrong on that kid's ability. And that's where I'm coming from the offensive line. I don't think I'm at the place yet where I think it's a talent problem. And this is where I disagree with some people that I've had conversations with and some things I've heard from others, right? I don't think what's going on in Notre Dame is a talent problem. I think that's really easy to do. And honestly, I think I don't want to say lazy because that's disrespectful, but I just think it's just too easy. It's like low-hanging fruit. It's a talent problem. Notre Dame did not lose to Marshall because of a talent problem. Come on now. They didn't. Just there's bigger issues afoot here, right? And it's just kind of like when what was it, 2007? Was it 2007 that Michigan lost to Appalachian State when they were an FCS team? If I'm remembering correctly, I think it was 2007. They come out and they lose to Appalachian State in the opener, right? This is a Michigan team that was preseason number 5 team in the country, coming off of an 11-2 season. A year where they were a top 10 team, finished the year ranked 8th in the AP poll. They came out that next year and lost to Appalachian State and Oregon, right? And so what happened? Well, that team eventually got rolling and, ended up winning the Capital One Bowl over Florida that year, over number 9 Florida, and finished the year ranked 18th. But, something happened. Was it just that the talent wasn't good? Well, the talent looked pretty good 2 weeks later when they blasted Notre Dame. It looks pretty good when they beat a top 10, Penn State team. It looks pretty good when they beat Florida at the end of the year. But there was clearly a disconnect on why that team, went 9-4 with some really, really good players on that football team. And so it's about. I just think it can be easy and kind of lazy to just turn everything into it's talent. No, it's not always talent. That's easy. And that takes the blame off the people that should put it there. And, to a degree, it does. There's the other say, well, you're not, because you're saying that these people should have brought in better players. I just think it's a little too of an easy thing to do, to just point to lack of talent, when in reality, I can point to you that talent's not the problem. I can point to you of how they're playing is the problem. The talent isn't being maximized is the problem. And a perfect example is, and I've used this a million times, 2018 LSU and 2019 LSU, same players. They didn't bring in an influx of transfers in 2019. Joe Burrow was already on that LSU team in 2018 and was the starting quarterback in 2018. Jamar Chase was on that 2018 LSU team. Clyde Edwards-Helaire was on that 2018 LSU team. Justin Jefferson was on that 2018 LSU team. Terrace Marshall was on that 2018 LSU team. And in some ways, they had guys, Devin White was on that team, right? He's a pretty good player. Well, he wasn't on the 2019 team. So they lost some really good players off that 2018 team, right? And that team, was a very mediocre team, in my opinion. That team went 10-3. They lost to Texas A&M, got beat 29-0 Alabama, lost to Florida. They had ugly win over Auburn. I mean, what was their big win that year, right? And this is what I've pointed to. Their big win that year was what? Miami. They beat, Georgia. I mean, I'm just, you try to look at it and say, that they weren't a great team that year. And then they go out the next year and they have one of the greatest teams ever. Why? Did the talent all of a sudden become better? Or did they do a better job the next year of putting the talent in position to be successful? And with the changes that were made. And so that's why I say is you got to look past just the easy explanations of, they don't have players. I've heard people say, they don't have speed. Lorenzo Styles and Braden Lindsey and Chris Tyree all of a sudden didn't get slow. Cam Hart didn't just all of a sudden become a slow guy. There's more to it than this that requires critical analysis. And I think that's why a lot of you tune in here, because we're not going to give you the easy, low-hanging fruit of, they don't have enough talent. To beat Marshall? They don't have enough talent to beat Marshall? Yeah, they do. A team that led Ohio State for 33 minutes and was tied for like another 4 or 5 minutes doesn't have the talent to beat Marshall? Of course they do. So what is the problem then? And that's what we're trying to identify. And then what needs to be done about it? And that's where we are right now. At least that's where I am right now. Sam also asked a good question. Sam, this is a really good one. How much does Buckner's missing the rest of the season hurt his development? Very frustrating because I think he's good, but still have questions if he's the guy next year. I mean, Sam, I think, in my opinion, that I am very concerned about the future for Tyler Buckner now. And it has really nothing to do with what I saw the first 2 games. There were things he needs to flat out get better on. He missed some big-time opportunities, but he also showed me some ability, and it's also, again, 2 games in his tenure. But you're now talking about a kid that's now suffered a second devastating season-ending injury early in the season in 4 years, so 5 years. And he's now going to miss a third season in 5 years. Now, one of them was not his fault. The 2020 season was not his fault. It was a COVID-related thing. It's not his fault. But you're now getting into a situation where can you really count on him to be that guy that you build your program around when he has just not proven that he can stay healthy? You did this offseason fine because he had the one injury. Well, now circumstances have changed, and he's now had a second injury. And it was on I think, kind of a normal football play. I don't love how he was driven into the ground, but that's going to happen in football. And then you say, well, okay, then just don't run him. Well, now you're taking away one of the things that makes him a good player. So I think it's really devastating to his development. And it makes me wonder, like, is this a situation? Can he get to his talent level? I don't know if he can. And I still believe he's very talented, but you can only get there if you play. And he's just not going to have a chance to play. And that's concerning to me. So, that's where I'm at. It's certainly a concern. Got this last question here from we're going to get this last one and then we're going to run here. And this is from Kevin O'Neill. Kevin says, thank you for the super chat, by the way, Kevin. He says, how quickly do you think Reese would be to give Angeli a series should Pine look bad? We talked about this in the morning show today. It better not be quick. He better not have a quick trigger on Drew Pine, because if Steve Angeli's not the answer, you have nowhere else to go. You will have crushed Drew Pine's psyche if you bench him quickly. They need to tell Drew, this is your team now. This is your team now. And go with them. And you got to give them some time to get going. You're going to tell me take a kid to come off the bench and start a first game against a pretty good defensive team and say, okay, you got a half to figure it out. That'd be terrible. If that were to happen, I'd say the coaching is the problem, not the player. Drew needs to be given a chance. 1 game, 2 game, 3 games, or whatever, give him a chance. The only way you make a change is if for some reason he's coming off the sideline, he's dropping his head, he has no confidence, and he's basically lost the will to compete. If you see that, then the leash needs to be pretty short. But I don't think anyone thinks that's going to be a problem with Drew Pine. I really don't. I don't think compete level is going to be the problem. Execution, he needs to do better. Reading a defense, making accurate throws, all that, he's got to do better. But I think he's going to battle. And I just don't think you can get in a situation where you give him a short hook. Can't happen. And I've been asked this a lot today. And This is what we said a week ago. Everybody's wondering when you're going to put Drew Pine in. Now that Drew's a starter, it's when you're going to put a Steve Angeli in. That's the life of being a starting quarterback anywhere, especially Notre Dame. The focus of quarterback right now is on Drew Pine. It should be on Drew Pine. And this is where I think fans need to say, I mean, you can talk about whatever you want, but can we stop calling for the next quarterback, please? Can we give Drew Pine, 3 games as a starter in his Notre Dame career to see if he's any good or not, as opposed to just writing him off now? I know it's not going to happen. I get it. It's what fans do. I understand that. But Steve Angeli should not be the question. And we're not going to really address any Steve Angeli questions moving forward. And that's not a knock on Steve Angeli, but it's just Drew's the starter. And let's see how he actually plays first as a starter before we start talking about his replacement. I mean, literally, Drew Pine has never started a game at Notre Dame, and we're already talking about benching him. Think about that. Think about that. We're already started talking about benching the starting quarterback, or what would the circumstances be to start to bench the starting quarterback if he doesn't play well and he's never even started a game yet? That just doesn't make a lot of sense. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's where I hope that we can kind of get past that. Look, Drew Pine's a starter. The players need to rally around him, and fans need to rally around him. Then let's see how he plays, and then we can evaluate it at that point in time. All right, so that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. A great job by Sean and Vince. We'll be back tomorrow. Ryan and I will be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. tomorrow for our normal 1 o'clock show. We're going to talk about the Notre Dame defense tomorrow, things we need to see them do to get better and be more effective, to make themselves better, to be able to put games away, and then also hopefully to help the offense as well. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow. Thursday, we're going to get back to our Cal evaluations. We'll do predictions and even more analysis of the Notre Dame Cal game on Friday. Tomorrow night, Wednesday night, we will have, obviously, Sean will be back for IB Nation Sports Talk tomorrow and for Thursday. And on Saturday, 10 a.m. from 10 to noon, Vince and Sean will have the IB countdown to kickoff. So they'll preview the Notre Dame Cal game and then, of course, the big games of the weekend. So thanks for joining us today, everybody, and we will talk to you again soon. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. Share this podcast. Give us a 5-star review if you're listening via our podcast platform. We'd appreciate that. Tomorrow morning, we'll have the CFB All-America podcast on the CFB Nation podcast channel. Please subscribe to that as well. We would appreciate that. They'll have a show tomorrow, kind of looking back at week 2 results in the morning, and then that afternoon around noon, we'll publish their second episode, which will be a preview of the big week 3 game. So check that out as well. So again, thanks everybody. Have a great day. Talk to you again soon on the Irish Breakdown podcast.